Hello, I'm Chris Stenzel, and I'll be presenting this talk with my colleague Nick Williams, sharing some of the results of our research, which takes an interactional approach to the investigation of multilingualism, focusing on the Vaupés region of Amazonia. We'll start with some background information on the Upper Rio Negro region and the Vaupés multilingual system within that, outlining some of its defining structural characteristics and looking at studies of language ideology and the assumptions related to language behavior that have come out of that. All of this as a backdrop to our primary research questions. Then we'll move on to our project and our approach to investigating multilingual practices, talking a little about our corpus and its creation through collaborative work with the language communities and a team of skilled Indigenous researchers. In our discussion of findings, we'll share examples of different types of data from our corpus. I'll discuss some excerpts from our sociolinguistic interviews that show explicit ideology at work. Then Nick will continue with discussion of excerpts from everyday interaction, data that allows us better access to implicit ideology at work, and that has revealed a range of practices that are not exactly what we expected, leading to some final comments on the implications of this kind of approach and questions we hope to address in further research. So let's move now to the Upper Rio Negro region, which spans some 200,000 square kilometers of the Brazil-Colombia borderlands in northwestern Amazonia and is home to some 67,000 people, many of whom live in the centrally located Vaupés River Basin, where we find one of Amazonia's remaining traditional small-scale multilingual regions. Though, given its truly Amazonian-sized proportions, both in terms of territory and population, we might think of as the big brother in the family of small-scale multilingual societies. The greater system includes languages from 5 autochthonous language families, alongside Portuguese, Spanish, and Tupi and Nhangatu. This language was introduced into the region in the 18th century, becoming the region's first lingua franca, and over time supplanting the languages of several indigenous groups along the Rio Negro. The linguistically diverse peoples of this region have been in contact for centuries, forming a multilingual society sustained by social practices that include a marriage system based on ethnic group or linguistic exogamy, virolocality, and egalitarian social relations. Although we should note that this description primarily involves the Tucanoan groups in the Vaupés and Piraparaná basins, extending to some neighboring Arawak groups to the northeast and southwest. This system results in the high levels of multilingualism that are the Vaupés' claim to fame, and is what really has been the focus of most of the existing literature. A different pattern of contact occurs between these riverine groups and the Naduhup and Kakunukak forest groups. This parallel system is characterized by non-egalitarian relations involving exchange of goods and services, and its long-lasting linguistic outcome is unreciprocated bi or multilingualism. Yet all these peoples have a common material culture, and there are similarities in mythology, oral literature, dances, and other types of ceremonial life. So this is a region that promotes cultural convergence while at the same time preserving linguistic diversity as one of the primary markers of ethnic group identity. Studies of regional language ideology indicate its essentialist nature, highlighting the role of the patrilect as the primary emblem of social identity, and arguing that language loyalty, essentially that one should always prioritize use of one's patrilect, is a defining principle. This principle leads to the hierarchization of the languages in individuals' repertoires, in contrast to what happens in many other small-scale multilingual contexts. Loyalty is also argued to drive a set of supposed and espoused regional language etiquette norms and practices, including avoidance of code switching and lexical borrowing involving other indigenous languages, denial of proficiency in other languages, little effort to accommodate to other people's languages, and to receptive multilingualism as the expected norm for conversations involving speakers with overlapping repertoires but different patrilects. Nevertheless, these assumptions are being called into question in recent studies, such as Silva's work in the mixed Desano-Siriano community, in which the regional norms seem not to apply, especially in context of everyday interaction. Silva's findings intersect with our own research questions involving the nature of Vaupés multilingualism and how much more there is to learn about it, especially understanding the complex relationship between ideology and practice. Our approach is to both listen to what people say about language use and, more importantly, to look at how people actually use their language resources in everyday situations. This eminently empirical approach requires extensive documentation and analysis of everyday interaction. And this, in turn, reflects a larger scale question of what kinds of methods will allow for better cross-contextual comparison of multilingualism itself, small scale or otherwise. Our project has focused on documentation of language use in everyday life among the East Tucanoan Cotiria and Waikana. But because of the multi-ethnic and multilingual makeup of families and communities, it necessarily also involves speakers of other regional languages. The most common of those is Tucano, now both the dominant lingua franca in the Vaupés subregion and the primary language of many of the in-marrying wives of Cotiria and Waikana men, due to processes of language shift. In total, our project gathered some 250 hours of raw recordings, and the corpus of transcribed and translated data being archived at LR has about 60 hours of interactional data, including 20 hours of sociolinguistic interviews. Throughout the project, we worked closely with the language communities and with Indigenous teams in planning, recording, processing, and analysis of this extremely complex material. Briefly, our database is composed of 3 types of interactional data, the largest being conversations that occur in the course of activities in everyday situations like these. We also have some recordings of pairs or small groups of people engaged in interactive tasks designed to stimulate commentary or focus on specific semantic categories. And I already mentioned our sociolinguistic interviews, but want to point out that these were conducted by members of our research teams in the Indigenous languages and with pairs or groups of speakers. So they also constitute a body of primary interactional data focused on speakers' perspectives on their own multilingual experiences. And I'll begin our discussion of findings with some excerpts from those interviews, showing that the precepts of explicit regional language ideology are very much at work and evident in the way people talk about languages and language use. This first quote from an older Waikana man illustrates how deeply language is equated with identity. I am the son of a Waikana. I speak the language. Our language is who I am. While this quote from his nephew shows the social pressures and exclusion felt by members of a younger generation who have been affected by processes of language shift to Tucano. We are ashamed when we speak Tucano. Ashamed, ashamed, ashamed. And this quote by a Cotiria man, son and husband of Tucano-speaking women, talking about how his wife reinforces proper receptive multilingualism within their home. When I speak in Cotiria with her, she answers in Tucano. It's the same with the children. That's why they can speak both languages so well. These are just a few examples of how explicit language ideology still shapes people's perceptions of languages and multilingualism in their lives. And now Nick is going to talk about our investigation of multilingualism in interactional data.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Nick Williams, and I'll take you through a look at multilingualism in the Vaupés from the vantage point of everyday social interaction. As Janet Chernella pointed out, there's quite a difference between the expected practices based on explicit ideologies and norms and the realities of actual practice. And as she pointed out, the realities of practice are far more complex. And we decided to explore this greater complexity by taking a look at language use in everyday interaction. So what have we seen so far? In general, in our corpus of everyday interaction in these communities, we have observed several things that are somewhat surprising or unexpected given the documented explicit ideologies. Specifically, we've noticed a lot of monolingual talk as well as less receptive and more accommodating interactions than expected. We've also noticed examples of code switching, which it has been claimed that speakers of these languages avoid. In general, this wider range of practices demonstrates the role of implicit ideologies at work. The first thing to point out and comment on here is that a great deal of interaction in our corpus is actually conducted entirely in one language, whether that's Cuatria or Waikana or Tucano. Interestingly, the Vaupés has been characterized as a society that is highly multilingual, so this was somewhat unexpected. Such monolingual conversations primarily occur among people who have the same patrilect, even if they do have other shared languages in their individual repertoires. In some cases, this is happening due to language shift, particularly in our recordings from the Waikana village, which show people, including ethnic Waikana, conversing almost exclusively in Tucano. Second, receptive multilingualism, in which participants each speak their own language, even in the rapid turn-taking of conversation, is the expected norm in these communities and does occur in our corpus, but not nearly to the extent expected and predicted based on explicit ideology. Also, this pattern is attested more in couples where the wife is Tucano, which we'll see in the extract on the next slide. This extract comes from one of our sociolinguistic interviews. Here, MC is a Waikana speaker and AP is a Tucano speaker. DD, who helped organize the recording, is also a Waikana speaker. And you'll notice that throughout the exchange, MC sticks to Waikana and AP sticks to Tucano. This is true of this short extract we include here, but also of the entire conversation. Despite the normative expectation that speakers will stick to their patrilect and thus produce receptive interactions, we found quite a number of cases of accommodation or speaking the language of another participant. And this is particularly in the context of family interactions. For instance, in the interaction on the right here, family, which included a Cubeo mother and a Cuatria father, was conducted entirely in Cuatria. This is a short extract from that conversation in which we can see the mother, the Cubeo mother, E.T., speaking only in Cuatria. We notice that the other children who likely understand and maybe speak some Cubeo as well also all speak Cuatria. In fact, the entire interaction throughout this recording was conducted entirely in Cuatria. This extract then demonstrates both the practice of accommodation by the Cubeo mother, as well as the noted practice of monolingual interaction, which is pervasive in our corpus. Finally, we present an example of code switching, in which a mix of receptive and accommodating practices occur. While some interactions can be characterized as primarily receptive or primarily accommodating, in other cases we see participants shifting or switching between these two modes. This recording was made on the porch of this couple's home, and here E.G. begins with a question in line 1, in which he asks ES about a container that she's making. The beginning of this exchange follows the expected receptive pattern in which EG produces talk in Quateria and ES responds in Tucano. Interestingly, in line 12, then EG produces some talk in ES's language, Tucano. We describe this here as a switch on EG's part from Quateria, his patrolect, to Tucano, ES's language. The question remains, why does EG produce talk in Tucano? But we specify this question as, why does he produce a turn in Tucano at that particular moment? What's the sequential context in which he produces this code switch? By characterizing the specific sequential context in which the switch occurs, we make it possible to compare this switch to other switches. We can make a few observations about where it occurs here. First, the talk is produced in overlap with ES's talk in the previous turn in line 11. This turn in line 11 from ES is itself part of a response to a question that EG asked at line 6. We notice a couple things about ES's answer to this question. First is that it was initially delayed by some silence, and second, it doesn't provide a valid answer to his query. Rather, it's a kind of transformative answer which treats the question, the initial question, as potentially problematic in some way. So EG's talk at line 12 then is occurring in overlap with a response to a question that he himself produced. It's also designed as partially repeating ES's own answer. It can thus be seen as co-constructing an answer with ES. Interestingly here, co-constructing an answer to his own question. So what exactly does this switch accomplish? We can't say at this point, but we can say that it is at least partially motivated by ES's delayed dispreferred response to that initial inquiry. And by characterizing the context in this way, again, we make it possible to look at other code switches in similar positions. We'll now offer a few brief conclusions on what we've done so far. We've begun to document the greater complexity of the realities of practice in this small-scale multilingual society. We observe that ideologies of linguistic loyalty are reflected in normative, interactional, and communicative practices. But departures from this norm do occur, including language alternation by individual speakers, so-called code switching. We also point out, though, that language choice is a resource for speakers and occurs in particular sequential contexts and must be implicated for constructing social action in interaction. Finally, while we have labeled turns in these interactions as Tucano or Waikana or Quateria, the question remains whether this is transparent or oriented to by speakers themselves. So do speakers of these languages orient to the multiple languages as distinct codes, or do they understand them all as part of a set? Additionally, our findings and approach have implications for how we move forward with studies of small-scale multilingual systems. The question remains, how does what we've documented here compare to interaction in other small-scale systems, and whether these findings substantiate the dichotomy between small-scale systems and polyglossic systems.